Okay, hello folks. Welcome to Medcan Presents, Return to the Worksite, medical and legal experts on potential challenges and how to address them. Today's webinar is hosted by Dr. Peter Nord, Medcan Chief Medical Officer, and it features employment and health law experts, Susan Newell and Kelly O'Farrell of Osler, Hoskin, and Harcourt. As restrictions lift and corporations prepare for the transition to what's next, many of the most challenging issues exist at the intersection of the legal and medical realms. Can my organization mandate that all employees get the vaccine? What options do I have if an employee declines to be vaccinated? What if an employee cites concern about the Delta variant as an excuse to avoid returning to the work site? This webinar provides context for employers navigating a historic transition. My name is Christopher Scholgen. I'm part of the team that creates content here at Medcan. And before we get into things, I'll just remind people we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. We'll reserve some minutes at the end. So you can, to submit questions, just use the Q&A function on Zoom or the chat function. We'll be accepting questions by both. Here's a little bit about our experts today. So Dr. Peter Nord is Chief Medical Officer at Medcan. He's a member of Medcan's Medical Advisory Services team, which provides guidance on wellness issues to some of Canada's largest corporations. He's also a frequent guest host on Medcan CEO Sean Francis's podcast, Eat, Move, Think. Previously, Peter was a VP CMO at Unity Health Toronto, and he's the founder of Stillbrook Accessible Retirement Residences, a registered charity focused on developing affordable retirement living communities. Our legal experts, Susan Newell is a partner practicing corporate commercial law in Osler's health industry and cannabis groups. Susan regularly provides strategic advice to health industry stakeholders in connection with mergers and acquisitions, healthcare corporate restructurings, and other issues. In response to COVID-19, Susan's unique experience has enabled her to provide comprehensive advice in connection with emergency response measures, business opening and reopening best practices, and screening initiatives. Kelly O'Farrell, expert in employment law. Kelly is an employment and labor counsel at Osler, Hoskin, and Harcourt. She helps clients mitigate workplace-related legal risks. Kelly has recently advised numerous clients on a variety of workplace-related matters arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. She works with her clients to create practical health and safety policies, reopening and return to office plans, as well as the necessary practices and protocols to promote workplace safety in the current environment. She frequently advises on managing changes to employees' terms and conditions of employment. Hello, Kelly. Hello, Susan. Hello, Peter. And with that, I'll turn it over to you folks.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Great to be here again. Welcome to Kelly and Susan. I'm sure all of us on the call have had a significant number of questions around return to work, specifically around vaccines and vaccine passports. Certainly, it's been in the headlines significantly over the last number of weeks. And I think it was a bit of surprise in a way, because we thought after we got on the right side of wave 3, we're on the downslope, things are opening up, we're feeling summer is here, we're feeling good. But the headlines just kept coming, and the controversy in Canada, United States, and around the world as it comes to vaccines and return to work have just increased. And so I know from our corporate clients at Medcan, they've been bringing forth many questions from either from their employees or from their senior teams about how do we address this? What do we do about vaccines? And the headlines are changing on a day-by-day basis. Provincial guidelines are changing day by day, and everyone seems to be doing something different. Health Canada is making recommendations. We're seeing what's happening from the CDC with regards to stepping back to recommending mask usage between people that are vaccinated on an indoor setting. So basically, it's a very confusing environment, and the science is the science, but it's, as we've found throughout the pandemic, it's the application of the science, which is highly political and culturally based, so that each province addresses the challenges in their own unique ways. That's just part of the reality of dealing with the pandemic. Not all bad, because each province, the needs may be a little bit different from the population health perspectives. But at the end of the day, if you're running an organization and you have accountability for the safety of your employees, for creating a safe workplace, these are important issues that we've been seeing increasingly. Kelly, Susan, have you been seeing a lot of these sort of questions from your clients of late?
Yes, thanks very much, Peter. We've been seeing a ton of these questions and various iterations of the same question. And I think you've framed the issues very, very well in that it is really important to remember that not all workplaces can be treated identically. There's different risks in different workplaces that, depending on what jurisdiction you are in, the policies and guidance differ from province to province, and they're not consistent across the country, as you mentioned. So those are all really important factors. And then when thinking about these issues, we think about what does a mandatory vaccine policy and what does that mean? A lot of people are asking us about that in particular, whether or not it's appropriate to implement a mandatory vaccine policy. And that can look at a number of different ways. And so from a high level, implementing whatever policy you have is going to be very important in order to ensure, as you mentioned, that the employer is fulfilling their obligations to take the reasonable precautions that are to protect the health and safety of their workers, and then balancing those obligations with the obligation to protect workers' contractual and privacy rights, and of course, human rights legislation. So when implementing that mandatory policy, we believe that it's quite important. If what we mean by mandatory vaccine policy means you must have the vaccine in order to attend the workplace, we believe that it's appropriate to have some exemptions from that policy to take into account specific medical or religious reasons. And I'll turn it over to my colleague Kelly to provide her views as well.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, as you mentioned, it's certainly a common question we're getting on a daily basis these days. Can we implement a mandatory vaccination policy? Can we require employees to get vaccinated? Can we ask them if they're vaccinated? There's a ton of questions right now from employers on these policies. And unfortunately, there's been very little guidance from public health or any level of government on what employers should be implementing at this point in terms of a vaccine policy. There hasn't been, other than to say vaccines are a useful tool in protecting the health and safety of workers, there's not much that pushes employers in one direction or the other as to whether or not they should go ahead with a vaccine policy or if they should stay away from it. So all we've got to fall back on is sort of the basic principles. One, Susan mentioned, we've got human rights legislation that we're always going to have to, and I know we'll probably talk about that a little bit more later, but there's going to be employees who can't be vaccinated, so you're never going to have something that applies to everyone. Whether or not you can implement a vaccine policy is going to depend on what as Susan mentioned, what your workplace looks like. Are you unionized? Are you non-unionized? Because that will inform what you can do. And on the union point, it's interesting. I've seen unions on both sides of the fence. I've seen some demanding very stringent vaccine policies and record keeping, and I've seen others saying there's no way you're asking our employees that we represent if they're vaccinated. So you really do have to know your own union and your own employees. Another thing that we, just in terms of basic principles that comes up a lot is whether or not you can implement the vaccine policy. In some cases, you need to step back and consider whether you want to and the impacts that's going to have on your workplace. If you're dividing employees up in terms of vaccinated and unvaccinated, what types of employee relations issues is that going to present to you? What types of retention issues is that going to present if employees don't want to be vaccinated and they know the competitor is not going to require it? They might hit the road. And then as also, just to repeat what Susan mentioned about privacy considerations, you're going to be asking for information from employees that you wouldn't typically have to handle. So you definitely want to make sure you're getting privacy advice on what you ask for and what you do with it once you have it.
Yeah, that's great. So we have collated a number of questions that we were getting and from our corporate clients. So I thought maybe what we could do is, to keep us rolling and focused, we could just go through a number of questions that the common things that we've been getting. And, starting with, as you've hinted, the question that comes off the top is, can an organization mandate that all employees get the vaccine? And then that leads to the corollary of that is not getting the vaccine or getting vaccinated a possible grounds for termination. Maybe we'll start with Susan for that one.
Yeah, so my perspective is very healthcare focused. And so in our view, you've got different considerations in a healthcare setting, being a hospital or a long-term care home or a similar facility, where employees must attend work. It's a high-risk environment, of course, and there's no such thing as doing all of that remotely, that's just going to be an impossible task. And so whether or not implementing a mandatory vaccine policy in a healthcare setting is appropriate, we believe that it could be appropriate. And there's a few reasons why. If we look specifically at the background of how vaccination has been treated in our case law, there is some support for having a mandatory vaccine policy in the health industry. And similarly, we're seeing now, of course, it hasn't been mandated by governments, but we're seeing some of the healthcare organizations and unions actually requesting it, supporting it, hoping the government will make these steps to implement and require a mandatory vaccine policy. But one of the things that we often think about is going back and looking at what does the employer have to do versus what does the government have to do. And so one thing that I think is very important to take into consideration is just because the government has not made it a mandatory policy does not mean that an organization can just follow that and cover all their bases automatically. And we look back to what happened in SARS, and we have to remember that the governments have a public duty, but the employers have a private duty of care. And so the hospitals and workplaces have an obligation to keep their employees safe that the government does not have. And so simply following specifically what you have to do under the law, we don't believe is going to be enough and could potentially lead to some exposure and litigation like we saw back, unfortunately, with the SARS cases. And so when I'm talking about mandatory vaccine policies, I do mean with those limited exceptions for those who cannot obtain the vaccine for physical or religious reasons. But can you fire someone who does not get the vaccine if you have a mandatory policy? I'm going to turn that one over to Kelly.
For sure. So at the end of the day, I think we're all on the same page that it's not possible to force every single one of your workers to get vaccinated. And usually the question is more, what do you do if they don't get vaccinated? Can you fire them? And I don't think we've got anything to rely on in terms of past case law that would allow us to say, yes, you know, if the employee refuses to get vaccinated, that's going to be just cause for termination, and you can walk away and be done with the employee. There are some employers out there who are taking the view. I've had a few clients say, well, I want everyone in my workplace to be vaccinated, and I'm prepared to terminate without cause anyone who doesn't want to be vaccinated and be part of this workplace as a result. The issue there, of course, is that you've got severance costs that you're going to have to deal with. And again, going back to knowing your workplace, knowing your employees, that may or may not be a significant liability depending on what, you know, how long people have been around, what their employment contracts look like. But there's currently, subject to human rights exceptions, there's currently nothing prohibiting you from firing an employee for any reason that's not discriminatory. However, you would owe them something on the way out the door in terms of either notice or termination pay, most likely in most circumstances. Obviously, there's going to be exceptions for extreme circumstances, like Susan mentioned, maybe healthcare is one of those circumstances. But at the end of the day, if you're prepared to take on that liability and that cost, then there's nothing under today's law that would prevent you from going ahead with that. And I apologize, I'm going to lawyer this a little bit here and qualify what I just said by, this is all new, right? Like we haven't had a pandemic before that we've had to work through. We don't have a lot of good case law to rely on. Most of what we are sort of looking at is flu vaccine case law, which is really not comparable. So, you know, who knows, a court might come up with some new remedy that, you know, terminating an employee because they won't get vaccinated even without cause is somehow bad faith. But as the law exists today, that's just not the case.
Yeah, and that leads to the whole issue around ethics and the human rights issues that come off of this. And you know, what do we do if an employee claims that they cannot be vaccinated and they use that? They say under grounds covered by human rights legislation. And I'll actually kick off by saying, you know, from the medical perspective, there is almost no medical reason for that somebody can claim not to be vaccinated. It really is a super rare instance where they've had already an severe allergic reaction to, let's say, a first dose, so they don't want to get a second dose, or they have a very rare allergy to one of the substrates, which is called PEG in the vaccines, and that's about it. And there's lots of medical societies that have come out and said, one body system after the next. There is nothing here that offers up any sort of reason for somebody not to get vaccinated. Conversely, lots of medical reasons to get vaccinated. So, in terms of that aspect of the human rights legislation, the medical is almost a non-issue. So then it does fall to religious and other choice issues that would fall under human rights legislation. So what do you think about that? If we were to talk about the human rights aspect and what can we do with somebody if they claim under human rights legislation that they're not going to get vaccinated?
Absolutely. So notwithstanding what you just said, even though there may be slim to no chance that the employee has, they claim they've got some medical reason for not being able to be vaccinated, your duty as an employer, once they've raised a potential prohibited ground under the human rights legislation, which for those who are not familiar are things like disability, religion, creed, pregnancy is actually covered under sex, which is one of the ones that we're getting a lot, is that I'm pregnant and I'm not comfortable in being vaccinated, which I would love your view on. But notwithstanding that you don't really believe the employee, you think they're just trying to work from home, you have to go through the accommodation process. So that once the employee raises the issue of a protected ground under human rights legislation, they've now triggered this accommodation process. So they have a burden in this process. They would have to provide you with that medical evidence. So they would have to go to their doctor and get a note saying, it's easier if it's medical because it's a note from a medical provider saying this person is unable to be vaccinated. And then you have a duty to accommodate them, which can mean many different things depending on the employee, and really does have to be a case by case. It has to be considered on a case-by-case basis. You can't have a policy that says, if person comes with this issue, here's how we're going to deal with it. You would need to consider, based on the employee's medical evidence, what options you have for accommodation. Just anecdotally, in some cases, that has included for non-COVID related medical issues. That might mean working from home. It might mean that they can't come to the workplace if it's too risky for them to do so. I think that's probably going to be not as common an accommodation that's required, but additional PPE. Maybe they can still come to the workplace if they're wearing a face covering and a visor and gloves, and maybe they're given a different work area or what have you. But you have to really consider that on a case-by-case basis, and that absolutely needs to be sort of referenced in any vaccine policy that you roll out. It's not enough to say, oh no, of course we'll accommodate anyone who can't be vaccinated for medical or human rights religious reasons for being unable to be vaccinated. You have to really spell it out to make sure in the event of any claim, you've got yourself covered, that you not only informed the employee that they would be accommodated, but you also have the accommodation process in place.
Great. And just going along with that, what options do I have if an employee declines to be vaccinated? So they've said that. Now, we talked about accommodation, but what other things, what other arrows do we have in our quiver?
For sure. So it's helpful to think of it in terms of two buckets. One is the human rights related bucket, where an employee is refused to be vaccinated. They've got some kind of documentation to support that refusal. That's the accommodation process. For other employees that don't have a reason for wanting to be vaccinated, and obviously there might be some that are somewhere in between human rights and being an anti-vaxxer. There might be someone who's got, a family history with vaccines, or is part of a historically disadvantaged group that's been mistreated by the medical profession in the past. So there might be some sort of less clear accommodation scenarios where you would want to accommodate and work with an employee to get them vaccinated, but there's no requirement to accommodate someone who just simply doesn't want to be vaccinated. As you said, the medical documentation is in support of getting the vaccine more than it's in support of not getting the vaccine. So you're not required to accommodate that. So that leaves you with, again, going back to the first question that you asked, you can terminate the employee, probably not cause, probably going to have to provide them with some kind of notice or payment on the way out the door, which may or may not be feasible. On the flip side, the employee might turn it on you and claim constructive dismissal. They might say, I wasn't ever required to have a vaccine before to come to work. you're imposing this new requirement, therefore that's constructive dismissal of my employment. And then they would make a claim for their termination entitlements as though they had been terminated without cause. And this is where it would be helpful if there was some sort of regulation supporting more zealously supporting employers in terms of vaccine policies where it's necessary or where it's reasonable, because that would give the employer something to fall back on. Well, we had to implement this policy. It can't be constructive dismissal. And then the other options are, I mean, you might not want to lose the person, so you might let them continue to work unvaccinated, in which case, you're going to have to manage them with other employees. And although it's confidential information, employees tend to share this type of information. So you might, ended up with a divided workforce in terms of those who've been vaccinated and those who haven't been vaccinated. And then the other alternative, and this is the most common one I'm seeing these days, is we're going to have we're going to give you options. We're not going to require you to be vaccinated. We're going to give you the option. And it goes back to something Susan mentioned in the first question. You can take the vaccine and tell us, or you can wear full PPE. We're going to require face masks and visors for anyone who is not vaccinated in order to protect the safety of other employees and allow them to continue employment on that basis. And I think that's the most common approach that's being contemplated by clients I've been speaking with lately, is allowing it to be optional and just having different restrictions in place for vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals.
Yeah, and Susan, is that something you're seeing as well?
Yeah, and I would say that in addition, in the healthcare setting, we talked about retention earlier. If you had a mandatory policy, are you going to potentially lose people? And then I think it's also to look at the flip side of that. If you don't have a mandatory vaccination policy, and then you have your employees spreading COVID to other employees, you could also lose your workforce and not have enough people to provide services. And that's one that, we're a little bit more concerned with in the health industry as well, because there's the exposure to patients in addition to workers. And certainly consistent with what Kelly said, one of the other things that we have suggested in the past is potentially unpaid leave. And of course, in that scenario, you'd need to look at whether or not the employee is unionized, and there's a number of other considerations there. But that's another potential interim measure if someone is considering but not yet received their vaccine.
Yeah, and from the medical perspective, one of the things that we have to remember is that the vaccines are extraordinarily good, like medical miracle of the century. We've never seen vaccines giving 90% protection, but they're never 100% as well. So even even a vaccinated population, there's still 10% of that population, even after being fully vaccinated, is still at risk and will be symptomatic and catch COVID and be actually able to transmit that. And then what we're seeing now in jurisdictions all over the world is that with the Delta variant, really the only individuals that are ending up severely sick and ending up in hospital and dying are actually the unvaccinated. So it is possible that you can have a vaccinated employee population relax some of those requirements, and they still can A, get sick, and B, transmit the virus if they should be contacted by that virus. And unfortunately, if that ends up being transmitted to somebody who's unvaccinated, they could get very sick and exclude. There are about 99% of all the patients that are in hospitals in the US right now are the unvaccinated. So the vaccines do an extraordinarily good job, but they're not 100%. I think that's an important takeaway, just in terms of developing policies around when do we start to relax our mask policy? When do we start to worry less about distancing? So I think that's the only sort of medical thing that we know for sure at this point. And that can underpin some of the policies and procedures that an employer needs to consider.
One thing to just clarify as well is that the minimum requirements for public health measures that each provincial government has laid out in their regulations still need to be complied with. Like in Ontario, indoors near other people, you still have to wear a mask. It's just over and above that whether you implement extra measures for those that have not been vaccinated. Just to clarify that, we're not suggesting anyone throw the rules out the window for vaccinated individuals.
Yeah, the government certainly sets the bar, and it's up to employers to be above that bar. And, unfortunately, what we're seeing in Alberta and BC is the government's taking some very interesting and very different divergent opinions with regards to mandatory use of PPE in public spaces. So it's a changing landscape for sure. And anybody who has a business that's multi-province is having to deal with, again, as I said in the introductory comments, this changing landscape that's different from province to province. Testing, that's another common area of questions that we've been getting. So can we require unvaccinated individuals to be tested as much as every day coming to work, in addition to requiring personal protective equipment?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. We're seeing more and more requests in that regard. And again, I wouldn't say there's one specific, yes, it's always absolutely fine. Like, it will be context specific. We are aware of many have implemented a mandatory testing policy. And when we think about testing, it's also important to think about what that looks like and what we mean by testing. So are we doing the PCR lab tests, which would be a diagnostic test confirming that you have COVID? Is it a rapid antigen test, which is quite common, which is a test that doesn't identify, it's not a diagnosis. In most provinces wouldn't consider it a diagnosis, and would then require that the individual go obtain a diagnostic test from one of the provincial assessment centers. And so the type of testing is something that's been very interesting to see roll out. And of course, when implementing testing, you've got a whole host of additional considerations there, because you're essentially providing a health service to your employees. And so you're not just in connection with vaccines, which we haven't touched on yet, but of course we mentioned high level, the privacy issues involved. So now when we're offering a testing service and there's potential for a diagnosis to be involved, we would need to make sure that the appropriate individuals are engaged to have the requisite training and understanding of what needs to happen to do that from a health perspective, which many employers, of course, don't just have on staff. So it adds a layer of complication there on the testing side, but certainly something that you need to have a reasonable reason to do the testing, and it would need to make sense for the particular workplace.
And just to add on to that, one other consideration is I have a lot of clients that over the past year have become very enthusiastic about testing, and I think it's a really useful tool, but it does put an additional, not only the burden that Susan mentioned about collecting information and acting as a healthcare provider, but if you have a positive result from a test that's not a PCR test, so the employee still has to go and get their PCR test, but you're holding on to this positive result. What do you do with that? Do you start contact tracing right away? Do you, do nothing until you have the PCR test? And I think that could be risky. Like, once you have the information about a potential positive case, I think you need to act on it, or you might need to act on it. And it's an additional burden for the employer to have that information, but it is a very useful tool in some circumstances, and we've seen it used. We've certainly seen it used over the past 18 months or so.
Yeah, and I guess just to close out on these series of questions, basically all that information is personal health information that historically wasn't collected by an employer. What are the conditions that should guide the management of this COVID-related health data?
Yeah, so there's a number of considerations that you'd want to make sure you're taking into account. So the first thing that we tend to automatically jump over is there a good reason for collecting the information in the first instance? So if your organization is one where vaccinated and unvaccinated people are treated identically, and there's no difference or reason that you would need to know that information based on the workplace, then requiring a mandatory disclosure of your vaccine status may not even be appropriate from a privacy perspective in the first instance. And then if we're talking about what's happened once we have collected that information, then it's important that the employer understands that they're only using that information for the specific purpose that they've identified to their employees it's being collected for. And it would also need to be handled appropriately on the back end. And so from a high level, that would include things like ensuring that the employees understand why the information is being collected. And that's probably becoming easier and easier to satisfy that hurdle. They'd also need to ensure that the data is only retained and not retained for longer than needed for the purpose for which it's collected. The vaccine and personal health information shouldn't be stored in an employee file or combined or retained with other employment information. And then lastly, this is considered very sensitive information, and the data should only be provided to individuals within the organization who need to use that information for the purpose that's been identified to the employees. So it's sort of a high level, these are the key things to think about. And then of course, in implementing some of those types of considerations on the back end, there's more detail required, and you need to make sure that you aren't just jamming it in the employee file with everything else.
One thing that we've seen a lot of employers do, if I can just add on one short thing and that we haven't mentioned yet, is anonymous surveys, which lowers the bar on what you do with the information, just to get a sense of what's happening with your employees. If you've got an employee group that's 90% vaccinated, you're going to have a different policy than if you find out your employees, 10% of your employees are vaccinated. So that's, if it can be done anonymously and voluntarily, that's often a good first step for employers to figure out what's going on within their workforce.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. That's probably a good place for us to actually stop there. I'm just looking, we're at about 30 minutes. So Chris, do we want to have a couple of questions that came in while we've been going through the session?
Absolutely, Peter, and fantastic context. We do have a number of questions. I'm just going to go in chronological order. And I'll skip over the stuff that I feel like we have already dealt with through the course of the presentation. So, first question: are you allowed to ask for proof of vaccination, or is there a mandate to you have to take their word for it?
So you can. We've talked about this. You want to collect as little data as possible, as few data points as you can. And so, we don't yet have the vaccine passport concept widely or adopted really anywhere in a broad sense, other than with respect to certain things considered for travel. So you'd really want to collect as little as possible. We are seeing some people ask for proof of immunization, but if here in Ontario, it has a lot of other additional information that likely is not relevant to the employer, like the lot number, dose number, where you got the shot, all those sorts of things. Like there's no reason the employer would need to know that. And so generally we would say taking the word for it is good enough, or a redacted version of that, which just shows and province by province, the confirmation is going to be different. But if you can sort of redact the other pieces of information and just disclose fully vaccinated and the date, that's really all that is relevant. So you should collect as little information as possible.
And I think this is sort of something that we get a lot of requests from US-based clients for a lot of information. I don't know if the rules are different there, but it really is important to drill down, as Susan said, on only what you need, which is basically that they've had 2 doses and the date they've got the second dose. But we do get a lot of requests for, brand of vaccine that they obtained and when the first dose was taken versus the second dose. And in Canada, we just don't think that's justified at this stage.
Okay. So we've spoken a little bit about various industries and how various policies need to shift depending on what industry you're in. Can we speak a little bit about the considerations that need to be taken for mandating vaccination policies, not necessarily in healthcare, but in retail or service industry, automotive industry, just basically other industries?
Sure, and if we had guidelines from the government on those industry-specific considerations with respect to vaccines, I'd be happy to relay them. Unfortunately, we don't have that at this point. So I would say you need to look at things like, very basic things that we've been looking at since the start of the pandemic. Can my employees socially distance? Can they maintain 2 meters of distance? Can they wear masks at all times? Can we sanitize on a regular basis? Although that's becoming less and less important, I gather. So, you have to look at what other measures are available to you, especially in unionized environments where you really have to make sure that the vaccine policy is reasonable and justifiable and based on medical evidence. you want to make sure that if you're going to have a really aggressive vaccine policy, it's going to be in a workplace that people can't socially distance long term, and maybe they can't wear masks all day. Those are the places where it's going to be more justified in terms of having a vaccine policy, but the policy itself is probably not going to be so different depending on like the actual written document itself is not going to be so different depending on the environment. It's more sort of what the policy is. Is it mandatory? Is it vaccinate or mask? Is it voluntary and you get to take your face guard off? And that's going to depend on the risk of the workplace and how you're able to mitigate that risk with other measures.
Fantastic. Here's an interesting one. So, and this concerns whether COVID could be legally viewed as a workplace airborne hazard. So with the elimination of government COVID protocols in many jurisdictions, do non-healthcare related companies have a duty of care to protect employees from COVID exposure within their facilities?
Is that a question?
Yes, yes.
Oh. I think the answer is yes, but Susan, I'll let you weigh in on that one.
Yeah, and I would agree that yes, there is. And I think that again, I hate to bring up SARS, it was a long time ago, but the same principles here are relevant, and that just because the government hasn't mandated it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing enough if you're complying with the bare minimum. So I think there is a positive obligation on employers to ensure that they are taking reasonable precautions to protect their workers, and the baseline bare minimum may very well not be enough. And so I think there is a private duty of care there that would need to be assessed for each particular employer.
And there's also, just to round out the response, there's duties under occupational health and safety legislation to protect the health and safety, take all reasonable precautions to protect the health and safety of workers. And there is a work refusals process in that legislation whereby employees can refuse if there's something specific within the workplace that they don't believe is safe. So there's that mechanism as well.
Fantastic. If a company does not implement mandatory vaccination for working in the office, what is the legal requirement if certain employees say they do not want to work in the office if there are unvaxxed persons there?
I mean, assuming it's a typical office environment, most places social distancing can be maintained and other measures are sufficient to, and I know, as Susan said, like the government guidelines are the minimum and shouldn't be viewed as the whole of an employer's obligations. But right now, I don't think employees have grounds in, and it would depend on what they're saying and why they're saying it's unsafe. But generally speaking, an employee not wanting to work with someone who's unvaccinated is not, I don't think it will be a justified reason to refuse to attend the office. We've certainly had a lot of those objections so far. I haven't heard any good ones that were justified. Obviously, you'd need to know the circumstances, but I haven't had a justified one yet where we thought, okay, that's fair. The employee can't work. They've got some sort of health issue or something like that they can't work with unvaccinated individuals. It just hasn't happened yet.
Peter, this is probably a question for you. For a multi-jurisdictional employer, what is the best resource for finding minimum provincial requirements?
Well, you can certainly go to, well, starting nationally, to be honest. So, going to Health Canada, gov.ca, I mean, all the websites that I think we're all pretty familiar with at this point, then dropping down to the provincial websites, the same sort of things. I think most of us at this point are pretty facile at accessing those relevant websites and platforms. And the challenge really isn't finding it, it's keeping up with the changes. So if you're a business that's pan Canada and you've got businesses going on in different provinces, it's almost a full-time job trying to keep up with the changes on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis that are happening across the different provinces. So I think it's less about accessing solid recommendations around policy, and it's more the challenge that we're finding is trying to keep up. And frankly, at Medcan, our medical advisory services group, that's what we're doing. We have a full-time researcher, and all they're doing is looking Canadian-wide, so province-wide, but also looking at what's happening around the rest of the world as well, and bringing some learnings home from that. but it literally takes a full-time person just doing nothing, even looking within Canada to try and keep up with what's going on province to province. So that's the kind of resource that it's taking these days.
I also find, I think it's harder to comply if you're trying to do exactly what's being recommended and only what's being recommended. It's going to be really hard to comply because every public health unit, every province, Canadian government, they've all got different levels. But there are some, like Ontario's got a great website with the requirements that would come close to complying everywhere because the bar is a little bit higher. Toronto Public Health has some amazing documents with checklists and guidelines and stuff like that, that while in Alberta, you might not be required to comply with all of them, they are in a very user-friendly form that's helpful in terms of learning.
Yeah, I just conclude by saying, like, one of the challenges is exactly that. You have to take the most conservative, consistent approach for all provinces. And it means that employees in those provinces where the government has really backed off on those requirements, they're looking at the employer and saying, like, what the heck? Like, why are we still doing this? The government, our provincial government has said this doesn't matter anymore, and you're making us do this. So that's actually the challenge, trying to come up with a consistent policy approach across all provinces, where in fact it's significantly more than where the government recommendations currently are.
Thanks to the attendee who pointed out that the Retail Council of Canada has a great website for requirements across provinces for the retail industry. So that's interesting. Okay, last question, which I think is an interesting one to think about. And apologies if we didn't get to your question. We will be providing contact information and follow up, and perhaps that represents a way to ask. But so the question is, can you comment on whether a vaccine mandate is appropriate? Oh, sorry. Can you offer, I'm asking the wrong question. Can you offer a monetary incentive to those that are vaccinated, include those that cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons to encourage vaccination? So the idea is, can you provide monetary compensation in order to encourage vaccine take-up?
So in my view, yes. And that person's already, a lot of the things I would say are in the question already, which is helpful. So you can offer an incentive, and the key to that will be it's voluntary. So you can participate if you want to or not. You go to your provider of choice to obtain the vaccine, and it's usually a little bit easier if you can separate that from the employer, rather than trying to offer also a vaccine clinic or on site, which is going to be very complicated and very different considerations. And then from Kelly's perspective, I'm gonna try to answer her part, which I should never do. But we'll need to make sure that the human rights considerations are still being taken into account. So if someone has a justifiable ground there that we discussed earlier, they would need to be able to have the opportunity to participate as well. And Kelly, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I noticed the question says medical reasons, and I just want to make sure we're cognizant of other potential reasons. Right now, we're thinking medical reasons, religion, maybe creed, although I haven't seen a supported assertion in that regard. The other thing to just keep in mind is I did have one client who had different groups of employees, like one particular race within the workplace were also just happened to be the ones who hadn't gotten vaccinated within that workplace. And so the question came up as to whether or not, even though it was a positive policy of offering a monetary incentive, all the employees from group A were getting the incentive and none from group B were getting the incentive. So the question came up as to whether that could be adverse impact discrimination. I don't think that's a reason not to do it most of the time. It's just something to keep an eye on, like, who are you benefiting and who's not benefiting from this policy, and making sure that you're not discriminating.
That's fantastic. Any final, let's wrap up. Any final comments or considerations? Peter, why don't we start with you, and then we can shift in order of how you folks are on my screen, which is Susan and then Kelly.
Yeah, well, again, I think that the takeaway is confusing times. It's a little easier if you're a solo business in one jurisdiction, but as soon as you get into multiple jurisdictions, we've seen public health units all from an enforcement perspective look completely different, even within one province. Certainly province to province, a real challenge. And the goal, of course, is always you have to have a bar that's high enough to if you're in a multi-province employer that covers all. And what we're finding now is in certain provinces where the government's really starting to back off on their regulations, the discrepancy between what an employer is doing to keep, frankly, the workplace safe and to keep the employees safe is being challenged by employees that are saying that's too stringent, that they've set too high a bar. So that's something that we're seeing is it's quite interesting and a particular challenge if you have a multi-province organization.
Susan?
Yeah, I would say one of the things to keep in mind is that you're never really done with your policy because things are always changing, and it's important to keep in mind that as things refresh, as things change, as we get more education, as the new policies come out, maybe as we get more guidance from the governments, things are going to need to be changing and need to be very adaptable in order to be able to ensure that you're complying at all times. And I'd echo many of Peter's comments. It's very difficult if you're in multiple jurisdictions to sort of find a one size fits all. And it's also difficult, depending on the type of industry you're in, you may have different considerations. There's a number of other health specific considerations, including certain legislation that requires you to ensure that you have emergency response protocols in place, and even specific obligations in the legislation with respect to immunization that I didn't delve into because they're probably not relevant to everybody, but just to keep in mind your industry may have specific things, although we don't have great guidance that's industry specific yet.
And Kelly.
I guess my main takeaway is whatever policy you're going to implement and whatever you're going to do, make sure that it's reasonable, it's well documented, you've ensured that you've complied with your terms and conditions of employment or collective agreement, you're in compliance with human rights legislation, you've done everything you can to reduce any privacy related risks. And as Susan mentioned, it's going to be an evolving policy. It needs a mechanism to be updated as hopefully guidance and circumstances evolve. But definitely get something down in writing, regardless of what that is. Even if the policy is simply to encourage employees to get vaccinated, I think that you need to have something about vaccines in your reopening policies.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I am just going to go through a couple of final administrative details. So if you feel like your organization needs help navigating your return to worksite plan, seek further counsel. Or does your organization need help navigating your return to worksite plan or seeking further counsel from Dr. Peter Nord or other Medcan Medical Advisory Services occupational health experts? Contact corporatesales@medcan.com. And then contact information for our wonderful legal experts. So Kelly O'Farrell is right there, and Susan Newell, there's phone number, there's email. And in addition, we will circulate the PDF of this small deck, and then these will be clickable links in addition. Finally, our next Medcan Presents webinar is Prepare Your Child for In-Person Learning. So that's Tuesday, August 24th at 12:30 p.m. And that features two Medcan experts talking about how parents can help prepare their children for in-person learning. It also features, it features some guidance, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. So that's Dr. Janice Wise, our Director of Child and Youth, and then Dr. Jack Muscat, who's the Clinical Director of Mental Health. Finally, thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Peter Nord. Thank you to Kelly O'Farrell, and thank you to Susan Newell. Lots of really important information here. And I think we had, it went a little long, but this is high value information. So thank you very much. And we will be putting this on Medcan or on the YouTube feed, which is youtube.com/MedcanLiveWell. Okay, thanks a lot.